Well, good morning. My name is Alastair MacGibbon. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at CyberCX. It's a distinct pleasure today to be speaking to Admiral Mike Rogers, the former Director of the National Security Agency and former Head of US Cyber Command. Mike is well known to many people in Australia, and so, as I said, it's a great pleasure. Mike is one of the true gentleman in the cybersecurity industry and a great friend of CyberCX and of Australia more broadly. Mike doesn't need much of an introduction, so I'm not going to give you one. We're going to try to weave that into the conversation today. Hello, Mike. Are you there on the east coast of the United States?
I am. I'm joining you from the east coast of the United States, close to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, as we call it.
Fantastic. Well, I'm actually coming to everyone from Wellington, New Zealand today. So we have 3 of the 5 eyes, Mike, as much as it can be. So, Mike, neither are so much into scripting. Everyone knows me as a bit of an anarchist, so it'll impress everyone that I have no great introduction for you. So I'm going to ask you the first question shortly, but just to keep me on track, you can try to keep me a bit honest. I was hoping that we could have a pretty free-flowing discussion, so feel free to put any points you want in. But I wanted to cover off on a few issues. How you think the cybersecurity landscape has changed in the last couple of years, the interaction between nation states and the impact that has on our economies and, frankly, to the survival of our societies, the connection between digital resilience and, as I say, economic resilience and social resilience. Is it an existential threat that we should be worried about? I'd love to talk about cybercrime, because I don't think we talk about it enough as people in this industry. And if we've got time, we've only got like 4 or 5 hours, Mike. Let's talk about the state of the cybersecurity market and the cybersecurity industry more broadly. So this is an opportunity for you to give a much better background about yourself than me. And I'm going to say, ask, how did you get involved in cybersecurity? What were your first experiences of cybersecurity in the US military? And then I'm going to throw to some harder questions, hopefully.
So I started my career in 1981, showing my age, in a very traditional part of the United States Navy. I was what we call a surface warfare officer, or a principal warfare officer in many of the UK and the Commonwealth nations. And then I transitioned into a specialized area of intelligence called signals intelligence. And one of the parts of signals intelligence was this idea of communications security. And as communications in the late 90s really started shifting into the world of the network, it became much less about communication security and much more about cybersecurity. Something really from the mid to late 1990s till, when I left the military after 37 years in 2018, and now working in the commercial sector.
Fantastic. Well, as I said, that's a better way of summarising your career than I ever would. Mike, many people wouldn't know, but you served under 2 US presidents, quite different people. One President Obama and the other President Trump. Now there's a President Biden. Could you look into your crystal ball and tell me about what President Biden's new cybersecurity team is going to be doing from a policy direction point of view?
Sure. So I'll give you an opinion based on experience. Now, remember, when I worked with President Obama, I also worked with Vice President Biden. And if you look at the team that now President Biden has brought in with regards to cyber, they are all individuals that coincidentally I worked with when I was in government. Interestingly, he has turned to the National Security Agency and its alumni to not just them, but he's using them. He has nominated a former deputy director of NSA to be his new director, a national director of cyber that has to be confirmed by the Senate, a great individual named Chris Inglis. His head of cyber in the National Security Council and as an executive assistant to the president is a woman named Ann Newberg, who is still an NSA employee. I worked with her. I worked with Chris. And the new nominated head of the DHS, or Department of Homeland Security, the cyber agency within DHS, which is the part of the US government that really has overall responsibility, if you will, for cyber. He's also nominated a former NSA employee and a former Army officer, in fact, to run that organization. So his appointments to date are marked by in-depth knowledge at both a technical and a policy level, both. Significant previous experience in government. He did not opt, like President Trump had done in several cases, he didn't opt to pull people in from the commercial sector, although Chris Inglis, his new senior leader for cyber, has been out in the commercial sector for about 5 years. And Jen Easterly, who I said again will be heading the agency, if confirmed by the Senate, within the US government that really is responsible for cyber overall. She's been working in the private sector for about 4 years since she left NSA. He also picked individuals who work well together as a team. I think that's another important part, knowing President Biden. The ability to work together collectively is important to him. I think he will also want to bring the private sector pretty heavily into his thoughts about cybersecurity and how we're going to work our way through some of these issues. I think also you're going to see a collaborative approach. I will say, and I know we're going to talk about it a little later, but the one thing that disappointed me in some ways about the response we just announced yesterday to the SolarWinds activity, I wish we had done this as part of a broader collective international effort. Instead, we announced a series of US unilateral actions. I wish we had also brought in some of our Five Eyes partners as a minimum, since many of those nations had also received impact from the SolarWinds events.
Of course. Well, I guess when you affect something that is global in terms of the way the technology gets used, the impact is global in nature. Well, let's pivot to that if we could, because I'd like to talk about the activities of non-democratic states in cyberspace. What's the greatest threat that they pose to, I'm going to say the West, I'm just going to say democratic nations?
So they're all slightly different sets of capabilities, different levels of investment, and different focuses at times. Generally, we always looked at 4 nation states and the authoritarian world: the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, and the North Koreans. If you look at the Russians, they've tended to view cyber as an element that assists them in their disinformation efforts. Those efforts are designed to weaken, if you will, the US, its allies, and many of our institutions to keep us polarized as a society. They also used cyber as a vehicle to place at risk critical infrastructure. So think about power, water, finance. The idea being that if we actually got into a crisis or a confrontation with the Russians, it gave the Russians more strategic options. And then they also tended to look at cyber as a very tactical military kind of thing. If you switch to the Chinese, very different. Number one, significant scale of investment. The Chinese, both in the Ministry of State Security as well as the People's Liberation Army, the 2 primary organizations within the Chinese structure that are focused on efforts in cyber. The Chinese tended to view cyber, number one, as a vehicle to be used as a broader element of a strategy designed to ensure the Chinese could acquire and develop advanced technologies. In this case, cyber is a tool to steal intellectual property rather than taking the time, the money to develop it themselves. So they were big in intellectual property theft. You didn't see the Russians doing as much of that. The Chinese probably also were not, unlike the Russians, they were not as much into cyber as an element of a significant, broad, and very deep disinformation campaign that was never really the Chinese model. The Chinese also, like the Russians, viewed cyber as a tool in the event of a crisis or a confrontation with the United States that would enable them to slow or degrade America, and I would argue, as well as our allies, our capabilities to respond to Chinese activities. If you look at the North Koreans, in some ways, they are the strangest one of all. Why do I say that? Because they were so isolated from the rest of the world, both by design. I mean, they literally have spent the last 20 years crafting a structure and a set of processes that are designed to enable them to operate largely isolated from the world. So they have built this from the ground up. Secondly, because of the sanctions, because they were so isolated, for example, under the current sanction regimes, the North Koreans cannot use the international financial backbone to move money, for example. So because they were so isolated, one of the things they decided was cyber was a great way to overcome their inability to get to funding and sources. So, for example, they're almost a hybrid nation state criminal entity. They're the only nation state I have ever seen at a government level use cyber as a tool to break into banks and steal money, to mine cryptocurrency, to break into gambling and betting sites, again, with a view to stealing. I've never seen that. Now, they also view cyber as an element in their attempts to gain insights on what the South Koreans are doing. So there's a very traditional espionage as well as an influence effort for them. The last one I'd highlight is the Iranians. They're a bit of a cross. And what I mean by that is, number one, interestingly, they tend to use a lot of contractors over and above. So Iranian companies, they often will not only use their own government resources, but they will go to Iranian companies and ask them to execute cyber espionage, cyber penetration of companies, cyber defacement of websites, efforts in cyber to stop companies from operating. So they're a bit of a hybrid in that regard. The Iranians tend to be very aggressive in cyber. I would argue, if you look in terms of offensive action that results in either the damage or the disruption of the target. You have not seen that significantly out of the Russians, out of the Chinese. You've really seen it once in the United States, at least, when the North Koreans did it against Sony. But you've seen the Iranians multiple times use cyber as a tool to disrupt or destroy infrastructure in the
like oil
petroleum
and gas plants,
segment within the petroleum segment in Saudi Arabia, natural gas in the United Arab Emirates. They, like the North Koreans, actually were upset with some of the things some CEOs in the United States were saying about Iran. So they use cyber as a tool to go in and attempt to take the companies offline. And lastly, if you go back 10 years ago, they were using cyber as a tool to attempt to disrupt our financial systems in the United States. So they've been very aggressive.
So, Mike, I knew it would be hard to get you to talk. That's my. Yeah, I'm glad you got that joke. I was hoping it would translated well, but that's great. It really, it's sort of like a nice stroll through the sort of four key sort of non-democratic threat actors, I think traditionally that would be seen. If you were to pick one, what's the greatest threat to democracies in those out of those threat actors in terms of which
among those threat actors
is?
Yeah, I would say there's two different scenarios that would concern me. Not that there aren't more, but two primary ones. The one that's the hardest for a democracy to deal with is the disinformation side, and the Russians are the best there. They're the most aggressive about it. You saw it play out in their attempts to influence the 2016 presidential cycle for us. You see it in the way they're attempting to ensure that we as a nation, and I would argue others as well, it's not just America, but I'll just stick to the US in this case. They've acted very aggressively to use cyber as a tool to keep us in somewhat of a disarray internally, going against each other to keep us so that we're destabilized, to try to undermine our institutions. That is hard to deal with in a democracy. Look, Alastair, in our former lives, when we were working in the security services of our respective nation, boy, if you asked us to, so we'd like you to get involved in ensuring the validity of identity or the accuracy of information in domestic social media communications. I would have been like, whoa, we need to really think about that. You want the intelligence structures of nations doing that in democracies. That would make me uncomfortable. And then the one that's often talked about, go ahead.
I was going to say, and probably make our populations worried as well. The interesting thing is that, as you said, if you were still running an intelligence agency today, it would sort of set the hair on the back of your neck up a bit, and it would certainly make our populations worried. But the question is, what structures then do we need to put in place to better protect democracies in that circumstance? Is it law enforcement agencies? Is it electoral commissioners or others in our various, however we manifest democracy?
Right. So number one, there's no one single entity that can solve this. This is about a multi-pronged strategy involving both the private sector and the government, and trying to play to the strengths of each of the components here. So, for example, I think there is a responsibility for those who host content on different platforms. There's a responsibility there in terms of veracity of identity and accuracy of information. Boy, it's funny. In the United States, we have these series of conventions, for example, that says if you are electronic media or print, a newspaper or a television station, there's a series of broadcast standards that you must adhere to. When we looked at this for social media companies, for example, and you got to go back 20 years now, we said to ourselves, well, people don't really rely on social media as the primary distribution of content, as their primary way of getting information, of their primary way of developing their views of the world around them and on different issues. So we don't really need to put any conventions or standards in place, because it's something that will be very secondary. Everybody's really going to continue to focus on newspapers and television. Well, how's that played out for us? So I do think that we need to acknowledge that in the social media world, those who host platforms, who project content, have some responsibilities here in this. And it can't be just, hey, it's not my job, I'm just a host. The content is up to others.
Yeah.
I just provide the forum, so to speak.
And Mike, and by the way, I'm really conscious of I apologise for sort of interrupting, because of course I'm coming from Wellington, New Zealand, routing through Sydney, Australia, out to you on the East Coast and then back again. So I apologise. I want you to come back to that second point you thought was a threat, but since I love going down rabbit holes, let me ask you about the social media companies. I've been reasonably vocal from time to time. I'm sure I win a lot of friends in them. I say as sarcastically as possible, of course. Do you think that they are more mature now? Have they willingly started? I mean, you see quite a shift in a Facebook and a Twitter for your last presidential election and following on. Are they now seeing value in actually enforcing the rules that they've claimed they've had for a long time, or are they doing it merely as a foil to stop legislative processes that you're starting to see bubble up in countries like Australia, pushing more responsibility on?
Well, clearly they were led down this road initially, at least in some ways, kicking and screaming. This was not their initial inclination. I think both because we saw the impact. 2016 was very significant because it really highlighted, I'll speak for the United States, it really highlighted in the United States, we hadn't fully appreciated the level of disinformation effort that the Russians were unveiling and executing every day. We didn't really appreciate it. It's not just about a single event like an election. You're watching them really sustain this effort over time. So you saw that. There's a definite, and I would argue you see it in Australia and other nations around the world. There's a definite backlash, may be too strong a characterization, but there's definitely a discussion now that didn't exist 10 years ago about, so what is the role of tech within our societies? What kind of oversights or regulatory regimes should be considered for them? Again, in a way that 10, 20, we never had those conversations. And I think the companies understand that, hey, look, there's greater concern, greater attention being placed on this, and they need to play greater concern and greater attention to this. I just hope we realize, look, this isn't just about a single event. What I mean by that is it's not just about, well, we'll focus on this for the election cycle and then we'll go back to the traditional ways we've done things. I don't think that that's a smart approach.
Well,
this is a sustained
that's
effort on the
interesting.
part of the Russians and others.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because, coming here from New Zealand today, I know the New Zealanders led a lot of that Christchurch Accord, working with nations and the social media companies about the concept of hate speech and rebroadcasting of horrendous acts that surrounded the Christchurch events. But so it's funny that a country like New Zealand that probably wouldn't have been in favour previously now is of that type of responsibility of those companies, and you see a lot of European countries that traditionally would have been more hands-off, more engaged. But I distracted you way back when you said there were two things. One was the misinformation, and then you were just about to get on
And
to
the
the second.
second thing really
interrupted.
is cyber as a tool to disrupt or deny societies, could be the US, Australia, fill in the blank, society's ability to execute the day-to-day economic and social activities that ensure the well-being and the prosperity of our societies. One of the benefits of this world, this hyper-connected world we lived in, we've seen unsurpassed economic activity, huge growth, great economic prosperity, been powered by this hyper-connected world we all live in. It's why we can do this, this morning in Wellington, tonight, the day before on the East Coast of the United States. But the flip side is this dependency makes us ever more vulnerable and dependent. And so the impact, it kind of goes back to, I know we had talked about this. Boy, I can remember when I first started thinking about opponents' abilities to use cyber as a tool to have an impact. In the 90s, it was an irritant. We never really thought about it as, well, they could use cyber, they being another nation, another group, could use cyber as a tool to stop us in the Department of Defense from doing our mission, from being able to operate, to be able to do the day-to-day kind of activities that we do around the world. We never thought about it that way. It was just a minor irritant. Fast forward to now, it doesn't matter if you're in the military, if you're in the private sector, if you're in Australia, New Zealand, the United States, wherever. Now we're concerned about, well, if I lose this connectivity, how do I operate? How do I execute my business outcomes? If you're in the private sector, how do we execute our mission outcomes, as we would say, if you're in the military? It's a whole different dynamic. Sure. So I'm going to keep talking for a moment because we've lost Alastair, but he'll be back. It's the nature of technology sometimes. I was talking about the ability of nation states to use cyber as a tool to impact. One thing that I know Alastair and I are going to talk about a little bit later, nation states get all the attention, but I would argue for most businesses, the criminal actor is the one that has the greatest impact day to day, because it's the criminal actor who's engaged on activities at scale around the world against business targets that they believe can provide revenue or money to that criminal actor. So they are incentivized, if you will, because they are generating money. Boy, ransomware is just exploding. 2020, the year we just completed, clearly was the year of ransomware. And COVID only served to make it worse. We found ourselves 15 months ago now in this world that was, for most business sectors, not all, but for most business sectors, still defined by large physical concentration of workforce, close physical proximity within offices, and most of our activities day to day within our businesses were conducted behind a well defined perimeter that the company created. And so our interaction on those networks with the outside world was all through this kind of controlled perimeter. And it went through a very centralized security structure that most companies had created. Then COVID comes along. And suddenly, companies, governments are forced to disperse people. Now we don't have that physical proximity. So we've got to push people away from each other. We got to get them home. We have to give them connectivity from their residences and other places. We have to do more mobile work than we used to do for many. And so the attack surface has proliferated. So the ability, as a person who used to penetrate networks for a living as well as defend them, the ability of criminals to penetrate systems has never been higher, in part because we have blown up the perimeter and we have pushed out all these devices out to individual users at home. And for most of us, this clear differential we had between what is work and what is home or personal, COVID has kind of obliterated those distinctions. Most of us are working at home. For many of us, we're using the exact same computer, the exact same software, the exact same home router system to do work, to do personal business, for our children to go gaming, for our children to go to school, for our families to communicate with each other, and for multiple spouses to, for example, both try to do business and work outside of a single residence. So, Alastair, back to you. I was talking a little bit. I took the time to.
Can you hear me? Can you start again? No, just joking. I'm just going to. So, let me ask you this. This is the, they always say don't do things over the internet or with children and animals, and you've got two of them on this call with you. So let me just ask you this. I often say that cybersecurity is an existential threat. I'm not looking for a long answer on this, just to get us back into the vibe. Am I right or wrong?
I generally don't say existential, because I define existential as destroying the framework of our system.
I don't want to hear your answer then. No, just joking. Go on.
Because when you say something like that, I'm thinking to myself, so you're talking about the destruction of our respective nations, the inability of us to function. So I don't think that, but I do believe we are talking significant. I make one last comment where I also say experience says not existential. It's interesting to me. If you look at society's ability to respond to events in the physical domain, think about responses to earthquakes, hurricanes, fires. Generally, those often take months to years to recover. If you look at cyber activity, we have shown the ability to recover, whether it be from a global event like a pandemic, whether it be from a global event like a NotPetya or a SolarWinds activity. We have shown the ability to pivot and reconstitute in a matter of hours, days, and weeks. So I think at times we're a little bit more resilient, than we give ourselves credit for.
Look, that's interesting. Can I and I apologize for dropping out before. Can we just briefly talk about the Microsoft Exchange server issue? And do you think the impact that will have? And I've got a particular question that I did speak with you about earlier on today, which was the FBI getting the warrants from the court to actually essentially covertly enter systems to take off the web shells associated with that.
Right. So we, the United States, have not formally named an actor, although most analysts believe it was the Chinese. Because Microsoft Exchange is a software that is widely used, the Chinese, in this case, we believe, were able to use a vulnerability within that software that enabled them to access a pretty wide number of organizations who happen to be using that particular software. it was so significant in some ways in that the FBI, as you said, interestingly for us, you have not seen this before in the United States, but the FBI decided that some of these vulnerabilities that were resonant within network structures in the private sector, companies needed help in removing the vulnerabilities. So the FBI went to a court in the United States and said, we want permission to access these networks that are in the private sector. We want to do it without asking the permission of the network owner. And we want to do it for the express purpose of entering the network and stripping off some of these vulnerabilities, in this case, web shells, that had been used by the adversary to penetrate the networks. And the court granted the authority. And so the FBI has been doing that now for a couple weeks.
Yeah. What's your view on the implications of that? Is it, I mean, one is, do you think it's an effective strategy? It's the first time you've seen it in the US. Two, what are the implications of it? And three, let me just ask this, that they didn't patch the systems then, did they? They didn't get rid of the actual vulnerability that was exploited. So could you chat through those three things with me?
Let's see. So make sure I don't forget. So first, I understand why they did it.
Anyway, so that's all right.
Yeah. I understand why they did it. The view was the private sector in some areas did not have enough capacity or expertise. And so the thought was, hey, the government could do this as a way to augment the efforts that were already ongoing in the private sector. So that was kind of the thought process, because the vulnerability was also assessed to be significant. In terms of what I think are the implications, the one thing I wish we had done slightly differently is I thought it was interesting. The FBI, and by extension, the government, did not publicly announce this in advance. They did not say, hey, look, we believe this is the issue. We believe that we can use government capacity here. We are going to go to a court. We're going to get the authority, and then we're going to execute the following kinds of activities. They opted not to do that. I wish that there had been a little bit more public dialogue in this, because to your point, within the U.S. structure, this is not an insignificant step. We haven't done it this way before. It doesn't mean we can't do it this way because it's legal, but it's an area I think we need to talk about. And then the last part you talked about, so what did they do? Did they remove the vulnerabilities? Now we're starting to get into a little nuance. They tried to remove the structure, if you will, that was being accessed, the web shells. And so by doing that, the thought was we're removing that method of access, if you will, for the actor.
Right. So you mentioned China, and there has been no attribution there. I just need to say that. Can we talk? I'd just like to pivot, if I could, to 5G decisions. And ultimately, I want to lead to this question of whether or not through the increased sort of importance of critical technologies, whether we're heading towards a balkanization of the supply chain and our reliance upon these technologies, and therefore a balkanization of the internet. So there you go. I've kind of asked that question through a statement. What do you think? Are we seeing what's going to happen with critical tech? I guess is my question. Are we going to see sort of an east-west divide on these types of technologies, and how will it work if that is the case?
So what you're seeing here, I think, is number one, if you look at China's strategy, China has looked at the last 50 years, 75 years, and I believe they came to the conclusion that one of the reasons that the United States and the West enjoyed such economic prosperity and such economic advantage was that it was the US and the West that developed the core technologies for the latter part of the 20th century and as we enter the 21st, that they developed those technologies. They ensured that the global standard bodies adopted their standards as the global standard. And then lastly, the Americans and others created these entities called companies to monetize that technology. And I think the Chinese have said, we need to do the same thing for the core technologies of the digital age, of the 21st century. And I think the Chinese have said to themselves, quantum, artificial intelligence, machine learning, 5G, nanotech, and biotech, I think they have decided those will be among the core technologies of the 21st century. And therefore, we need to be the ones that create, if you will, the technology. We need to get our standards then globally adopted, and we need to create large Chinese companies that can then monetize these and generate economic advantage for our nation and our citizens. And so 5G, in some ways, to me, is the poster child for this phenomenon, where you saw, in this case, other governments, the United States, Australia, the UK, Canada, we all looked at this technology and said, 5G is going to be foundational to our abilities, to our respective nations' abilities to be economically competitive in this digital economy. We have got to make sure that nothing threatens that. And one of the things that we were concerned about that might threaten it would be if you used infrastructure from an authoritarian nation whose legal regime allows the government, in this case, the Chinese government, the law in China allows the Chinese government to compel any Chinese company or Chinese entity on the grounds of national security, which is very loosely defined within the Chinese legal framework. It gives them, the Chinese government, the legal authority to compel companies to engage in activities that they might not want to otherwise do, which is one reason why when Huawei would often say, we would not interdict the flow of information, we would not cut off the network structures, we would not use this as a vehicle for espionage, for example. In the US and in Australia, our governments felt, but you don't have a choice under your legal framework. If the government decides they want you to do it, you have to do it. And so 5G to me, in some ways, is the poster child for these series of technologies that both China, the United States, and others are going to be the key to economic competitiveness in the 21st century. So you've seen governments now start to step in and take a much more aggressive role. You've seen it in 5G. I think you're going to see it in quantum computing. I think you're going to see it in AI. You can argue you're seeing it already. You're certainly seeing it, for example, in the United States, extend to the production of semiconductors, for example, which are kind of the fundamental building blocks for many of these more advanced technologies.
So is it now going to be back to that sort of, I guess, the question I'm really asking is, are we going to see that east-west or sort of non-democratic state, democratic state divide? And will it therefore, the Five Eyes is spoken about so openly these days compared to the past, right? Are we talking a Five Eyes type relationship? Should there be more countries in that? Is the Five Eyes the wrong vehicle for carrying out that strategic technology discussion? You've got Nordic countries that are important. You've got some North Asian countries that are extremely important in that technology space. What should that sort of alliance look like? Does it all need to be in the US and designed and manufactured in the US and shipped to the world? Or what will the future of that critical technology look like?
So first, you're seeing two different approaches play out between President Trump and President Biden. President Trump, in some ways, tried to argue that isolating China with respect to 5G and Huawei, for example, was the better answer. Keep them out of Western markets, keep them out of Western infrastructure, forestall their ability to access Western supply chains, for example. Hey, try to isolate them. President Biden, while he hasn't removed any of those actions that were taken against Huawei during the Trump era, President Biden, I think, is a little bit more inclined to, rather than create separate structures, so to speak, we need to see if we can bring these two worlds together. And you want China to continue to be a part of this, in part because I think in President Biden's mind, look, if they're a part of this process, if they're part of this structure, that means they have an ownership in its continued operation. They got a stake in wanting it to continue to work. It will tend to forestall, in some ways, I think the thought is, some of the maybe policy swings that you might see. We're going to have to see how this plays out over time. I think you also raise an important point about this is so much larger an issue than just the Five Eyes structure. The Five Eyes are a good starting point in the sense that because we've got these structured relationships that were always built around intelligence and national security. And the argument with 5G, for example, was this is an element of national security, and economic competitiveness should be viewed as an element of national security. So there is a framework that we can start from. But to your point, which I think is very valid, Alastair, it's not enough. You look at the Nordic nations, look at Europe, look at Japan, South Korea, India. There's so many other significant elements that we could bring together. I think a more common approach, and again, you're seeing this from President Biden, he talks about the democracies of the world working together to ensure that technology is used as a vehicle to ensure the continued free flow of ideas and economic activity between nations.
Great. Can I pivot here, Mike, to the concept of critical infrastructure and critical infrastructure regulation? So you're aware that there's what's called the SOCI Act changes before the Parliament in Australia, which will see increased responsibilities for organisations in terms of their cyber resilience. Firstly, what's your view on that? And secondly, will you see something similar happening in the US?
So it's an area that Australia is definitely ahead of the US on. The first comment I would make is we have got to think about infrastructure in a very different way. I was during the Obama era, we initially identified 16 different sectors within our economy as being critical infrastructure. And we used the definition of if they were to be disrupted, degraded, or destroyed, or our ability to use them was denied, it would either have significant impact on the health and well-being of our citizens, or it would have major economic impact on the economic well-being of our nation. And then finally, it would also potentially or have significant national security impacts for us. But if you look at those first 14, and again, I was part of those discussions, they generally were focused with physical outputs, physical processes, fuel, money, power, electrical power, aviation. We did not think about processes like an election. It took until 2016. And then again, when I was part of the part of the Trump team, we added a 17th sector, the election segment. We added that as a critical infrastructure. But I think we still aren't thinking broadly enough. Critical infrastructure to me includes things like data, includes things like supply chains. It's not just something that is produced. It goes to your ability to operate. Critical infrastructure to me is what does it take to ensure the safety, well-being, and the economic well-being of your nation in this digital hyper-connected world that we're living in. And that's when you think about it that way, you start to bring in elements that under the traditional industrial 20th century kind of definition of critical infrastructure, you might not consider. So I think we need to think about it more broadly. I think we finally... Go ahead, Alastair.
Oh, I was going to say, because I don't want you to forget your point, but when I look at our sectors, I'm not sure they're much different to your 16 that you originally talked about in the Obama era, which worries me a bit. And I don't think our democratic institutions are one of them, and that always surprises me. And then I don't know how you capture the supply chain, but could you go back to that point with our time lag when I interrupted you?
No, the other point I was going to make is it also goes to this idea that one of the challenges of cybersecurity is to achieve the outcomes, I think, that our respective nations, whether it be New Zealand, Australia, United States, and others, to achieve the outcomes I think we want in cybersecurity. This idea that, we'll have the government go do its thing and we'll have the private sector go do its thing, I think is fundamentally flawed. And my comment would be, we've been doing it now for well over a decade, and it is not working the way we want it to. I think the future is
So what
much
should
more.
happen?
I think the future is much more about integration, not just collaboration. Collaboration to me was I'll do my thing, you do your thing. And if either of us see something that might be of interest to the other, we'll try to remember to tell you about it. The challenge to me gets to be everybody is so busy. You got your head down trying to, in this case, cybersecurity. You got your head down trying to take care of the day to day. You aren't thinking at the front of your mind about, well, how might this information help somebody else? That just isn't the, happening as much as I wish it did. The other point I would make is why would you want to replicate in the government the billions of dollars and the massive amount of expertise that's resident in the private sector? Why would we try to replicate that in the government? I don't think it's achievable. I don't think it's financially sustainable. And I don't think we got enough people to try to replicate what the private sector has in the government. So I think the answer is go ahead.
Oh, no, please. You're just getting to the answer. All right. I apologize.
So I think the answer is why aren't we integrated, working problems together 24/7? I look at solar winds. The government was the primary, not the only target, but governments were the primary target. And yet not a single entity in the government detected this activity. It was the private sector that identified it. And if you look, and again, because some of the other things I do, I happen to be involved with some of the organizations that were dealing with this directly early on. There's a time lag between when an entity first recognizes activity, they go in to try to understand it, make sure they really understand it, and then communicate it. And I'm thinking if we were working together side by side, real time, we wouldn't have to wait weeks till we had researched an issue and then decided we should go tell somebody else about it. We just you can't get fast enough if we don't do this. And the last point I would make is collaboration generally focuses on after something bad has happened. I want to get ahead of problems. I want to stop them from happening. And I want to be in a position where we're able to forestall bad things, not just respond to them.
So one of the questions I ask myself regularly, Mike, is government disrupted in this space? You mentioned the concept of why replicate what the private sector has. There would have been a time in your roles during your career where the government clearly led in this space. And you'd argue that while there are some very key elements where you would expect the government to stay, there are bits where the private sector can indeed lift. So I'm keen on what areas those are and which bits should always rightly stay with government in a democratic type government. But then how do you get this collaboration bit you talk about? Working side by side would worry others, right? So how do you get this, because the private sector working with governments without being seen that the government's then manipulating in private enterprises?
Right. So let me go to that part first. In the US, I think there's a great model, aviation safety. We decided as a society that the level of risk posed by the loss of aircraft, where we literally could lose hundreds of people at any one time, presented such a level of risk to the safety and well-being of our society that we were going to impose collaboration between the government and the private sector. So every time we have an aviation accident anywhere in the world, involving on the American side, but almost every nation has developed similar sets of processes. We send a government investigative team that partners with the company that owned the aircraft, the company that built the aircraft, the union that employed the employees that were on that aircraft. And we literally work together collaboratively. We review, let's see the maintenance records on that aircraft. Let's look at the training of the flight crews. Let's look at the behavior of the flight crews in the hours and days leading up to the actual accident. Hey, I want to see what the maintenance was done on the aircraft. We literally make all of that available. We then come to a formal conclusion as to what caused the accident. And then we impose a series of changes. We mandate changes in flight crew training. We mandate changes in maintenance. We mandate changes in construction. We mandate changes in operational patterns. There's a reason why, if you look at aviation, while we have aviation accidents, number one, they tend not to repeat over time. Generally, we do not see patterns of recurring the same accident profiles happening over and over and over again. Now, look at cyber. In cybersecurity, we see the same vulnerabilities exploited over and over and over again. Why? Because under the current structure, the victim or target is not incentivized to acknowledge the activity in many cases, to be forthcoming as to why and how it happened, or to allow others to take a look at, well, how might we make sure that this doesn't happen again? One of my biggest frustrations when I was in government and I was part of a team that had responsibility for defending networks, or we were often deployed to the commercial sector to help them, I often thought to myself, man, I want the pain of the one to lead to the benefit of the many. And yet what I see is the pain of the one just keeps recurring over and over and over again. We kept responding to the same events for the same vulnerabilities across the spectrum of companies. So I just think there's an interesting model where our societies have decided risk to the well-being and the economic activity in the form of aviation represents such a high level that we felt that there was a reason or a rationale to take a very different approach. We don't do that in every area. I think there's a very good model there. I also think there are some areas where the government brings a lot of expertise. You know, I used to kid, again, in my previous life, I would say, look, in the private sector, you're not inside the bad guys' networks. That's what we do. You're inside your own networks and you're watching the space leading into that network. I'm not only looking at that space outside the United States in my own nation, trying to look at that space to see the activity, but I'm also sometimes inside some of those networks that are originating the activity. So I'm seeing it develop. I'm watching them train. I'm watching them develop the kinds of tools they're going to be using. That's something unique for the government. The private sector, on the other hand, access to great technology, has done some great things in terms of developing capabilities, practices, methodologies with respect to cybersecurity. I think if we could come together, we could just be so much more effective. And by coming together, I mean, why aren't we working side by side in, security operations centers? Whether it's in the private sector or you want to come to the government side, why aren't we partnering with each other? Because this status quo is not good and it's not going in the right direction. It's getting worse, not getting better.
Right. So that's something for us to work on. I'm just going to time check you and I, Mike, because as I said, I didn't ever suspect we would be short of questions, and nor that you will be short of phenomenal insights. We've got, by my reckoning, about 6 or 7 minutes, and I did want to get to the topic of cybercrime. Are we doing enough? Let me start with a question, and I'm going to ask you to give us sort of a 30-second answer. Are we doing enough about cybercrime?
So the bottom line is no. And the lines are blurring. You and I were talking about this. You're seeing nation states create relationships with criminal entities. You're seeing criminal entities creating relationships with nation states. You just saw the Department of Treasury on the US side publicly acknowledge, hey, look, we have watched the Russian security services create relationships with criminal gangs in Russia to use ransomware as a tool against targets that the Russian security services are interested in, that criminals are interested in.
Can I read the direct quote? And for those who are following along, it's from the US Department of Treasury's 15th of April communique in relation to sanctions against the Russian state and a number of named private sector organisations. But the actual piece that's of interest in and part of this discussion is, to bolster its malicious cyber operation, FSB cultivates and co-opts criminal hackers, including the previously designated Evil Corp, enabling them to engage in disruptive ransomware attacks and phishing campaigns. that doesn't imply that it's just for the nation state's benefit. That it's part of FSB's targets. This is the implication from this, and it's a pretty sort of rare implication, is that you have a nation state actively encouraging criminal groups to go out and sow crime in other countries.
Oh, no, I agree. I mean, and again, we have been watching this for a while where we just thought, wow, the Russians are clearly showing that they want to use a wide range of tools, both their own and others, to have an impact against the economic well-being of the U.S. and other nations around the world. And they're going to do that in themselves, and they're glad to help others like criminal groups who are interested in doing so.
I mean, it's an incredible sort of, to me, that's one of the more significant things in that 15th of April communique. But obviously we would argue that ransomware and other criminal activities is much more broad, of course, than, say, an FSB-backed entity or two.
Right.
How do we drive cost into criminals and their operations and out of our own as Western societies?
So, number one, we have to take away their sanctuaries. It's not by coincidence, for example, that the most successful cyber criminal groups operate in Russia and Eastern Europe, where law enforcement is weak. They're often given protection by the nation states as long as they'll engage in actions the nation states thinks are positive from the nation state's perspective. So we got to take away their sanctuaries. And we got to make them realize that, hey, look, we governments, you can be reached anywhere. There's no place to hide. You can't think that, well, I can operate in Russia and they're not going to, nobody's going to bother me because the Russian government's going to leave me alone. And the Americans or the Australians or the the Kiwis, hey, they can't touch me here. I think also it would be a really interesting discussion about what are the implications, for example, if we outlawed companies paying ransom? If companies didn't have a choice, they couldn't pay it. Criminals operate because they can generate money, because they believe and have seen to date that many companies are willing to pay them to the point where they're incentivized to continue and, in fact, increase their activities. So we need to ask ourselves, well, what do we do to remove that incentive? What do we do to lead them to believe that, hey, look, there's not a high probability of success? So I've been thinking to myself of late, well, what are the implications if we flat out said that you can't pay? Now, we do that now, for example, in the United States. The Department of Treasury has specifically stated as a reminder, it is illegal, and the Department of Treasury talks about potential prosecutions. It is illegal for a U.S. company to pay ransom to any entity, nation state, individual, or group that is currently under a sanction regime from the U.S. government. So the U.S. government has, in a very narrow way, already done this. I wonder what the implications would be if we expanded this. And I don't know the answer.
Yeah. And then it would have to be something that, frankly, liberal democracies around the world supported each other on, right? To cut off. Right. It's probably not dissimilar to things like the drug trade and financing of organised crime more broadly. And so I'll ask you, Mike, before I wrap up. And as I say, I'd happily do 3 or 4 hours with you, and that I can't wait till we can travel together again.
Yeah.
But if you were assuming that's done, the banning of those payments, and if you're in charge of a law enforcement agency today, what's the one other key thing that you would do?
One of the things I'd be interested in is how can, within the private sector, how can we work more closely together? I talked about the government and the private sector, but I think the first starting point would be, because we could do that right now, and every nation's trying to do it. I mean, Australia's tried to do it, the United States. Again, we have got to work more closely with each other. It was interesting in the U.S. in the financial area. You had the leaders, the CEOs of the largest banks and financial institutions in the United States said to each other, we compete against each other every day in areas of business. When it comes to cybersecurity, we are not competitors. We are individuals facing a common set of actors and a foe, if you will, that represents a fundamental threat to our business model. Therefore, despite the fact we compete in some areas, we need to cooperate and work collectively when it comes to cybersecurity. I think we need to expand that into a whole lot of other sectors and areas.
Fantastic. Well, thanks, Mike. And Mike, I think we got about a third of the way through questions. The one time I actually prepare for something, it'll teach me not to prepare again, right, Admiral? But look, can I just say thank you to you? You're a good friend of CyberCX, which we clearly appreciate, but more importantly, you're a good friend of Australia and a lot of people and of New Zealand, frankly, knowing that I'm sitting here on New Zealand soil. And I just want to thank you again. Sorry for the technical glitch, and I'm told on my phone that you did a great job of filibustering. So thank you for doing that, and I'm glad I got you out of your shell to talk.
Yeah, there you go. Thanks very much, Alastair. Okay. It's an honor to be part of CyberCX team.
Cheers, Mike.
Good morning, everybody.